Hi, Cassidy here, and this is Writing Artistry, a place where I explore what it means to create more sustainably. Today, I have a conversation for you with Richard Rohlin. Richard is someone that I have seen online having some of the most interesting conversations about ancient texts and history and how we as modern people should understand them. And so I thought it might be interesting to sit down with him and have a conversation about what it looks like for more modern forms of art, such as filmmaking, to engage with some of these ancient stories and how we should see those interactions and do that responsibly. And what came from that was, I think, a really beautiful conversation. So I hope you enjoy it. And yeah, that's it. Richard, thank you so much for having a conversation with me today.
It's great to be here.
Yes, I'm very excited for this. I told you this before we started recording, but I'll say it again for people. My husband is very excited that I'm talking to you. He's a big fan. He loves
Awesome.
the Lord of what's the Lord of the Rings podcast that
School.
yes. Yes, he's a big fan of that, and he makes me listen to it. It's probably the nerdiest thing I've ever listened to, but it's very interesting.
It is pretty nerdy sometimes.
But anyways, I know that you've been kind of around the internet and YouTube, so some people might know you, but for
Yeah.
people who don't know you, why don't you give a little bit of an introduction, who you are,
Yeah,
and
great.
what's your work? What do
Yeah.
you do?
So my name is Richard Rohlin. I'm a Germanic philologist. Which means that I study vowel changes in misty forests. Basically, it's really philology is about studying the language and literature of ancient peoples kind of alongside each other. So whereas
Mm,
a literature person might just study literature, or a linguist might just be interested in language, we as philologists were kind of interested in both of those things at the same time, and the ways that both languages and stories kind of grow and shift and change over the centuries. So that's kind of my area of academic training. I'm an Orthodox Christian. This makes me so I'm also very interested in like church history and things like this. And it was kind of the Venn diagram overlap of these things led to me doing a series with Jonathan Pageau on his channel called Medieval Universal History, and we've been doing that for like 3 years now almost. And that's probably the most popular thing that I do and the thing that people know the best. I
mhm.
also do a Tolkien podcast on Ancient Faith Radio with Father Andrew Stephen Damick, called the Ammon School Podcast, which is about reading Tolkien's works as an Orthodox Christian. So yeah, those are some of the things I do. I also farm, I fight, I have a lot of kids, and that's about it.
And what got you interested in philology?
That's a great question. It started out being just interested in Tolkien, as a not just somebody whose writing I enjoyed, but whose writing really kind of saved me
Hmm.
uh, um, in a really deep way. I mean, I grew up in a very I've talked about this other places, but I grew up in a really fundamentalist context
Mm,
where fiction, the reading of fiction just simply wasn't encouraged. Especially by, well, anyway, it just wasn't encouraged. And Tolkien's works were actually something that I really enjoyed when I was young, and then I set aside during my teenage years,
mm,
and then came back to in my early 20s when I was feeling a kind of a dryness in my life, and then just kind of like going through uh, just a really dark time spiritually. And uh, reading Tolkien, kind of, coming back to at him, and it wasn't just the stories themselves, but even like his nonfiction writing, like his philological essays and things like this, which is not, always his best stuff. He's a much
mm,
better fiction writer than he is a nonfiction prose writer. And even as a lecturer, he had a reputation for being like kind of quiet and mumbling and boring, and and like not a great lecturer, but I mean definitely this amazing mind. And I felt sort of a kinship there that I
mm.
had never really found with another person up to that point in my life. And so anyway, so Tolkien was himself a Germanic philologist.
Mhm.
And so I kind of started this program. Another really important book for me at that time in my life was C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, which is a book I've talked about quite a bit.
Mhm.
The Discarded Image is about trying to recover the medieval model of the cosmos, or at least, if not recover it, at least appreciate it. And again, having grown up in this really fundamentalist context, I found the medieval model deeply compelling, and I felt like it kind of answered some of um, the gaps, or like the sort of, if you feel like your life is missing something, and then you find the thing that your life seems to be missing, which is what do you actually do with beauty? What do you actually do with stories? What do you actually do with the kind of messy things that fundamentalism is uncomfortable with, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like, what do you do with those things, and where do you put them, and stuff like that? I found the discarded image to be a really beautiful, very helpful work in that regard. And so what I did was to uh, uh, I just said I'm going to read everything that Lewis talks about in the discarded image, because it's basically sort of, if you haven't read it, it's like an overview of medieval literature. And so I said, I'm just going to read every work of literature that he talks about in the discarded image. And along the way, I just realized, well, I should do this with people who know what they're talking about, because that would just be, it'd
Easier.
be easy that way. And so that's sort of what led me to pursue a graduate degree in the stuff. And then when the opportunity to do that in Germanic philology opened up, it was just kind of like, this is the thing I'm supposed to be doing. And it was a perfect dovetail of kind of all those different things. So
Mm. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I love the sort of relationship that Lewis and Tolkien had, in the way that their like literature plays off each other, like, and the way that you talked about how he Tolkien wasn't this like great essay writer or speaker, but you had this opposite with Lewis, where it's like
yeah,
he also does the fiction, but it's not quite as well loved, at least at this point, the way
yeah.
that Tolkien's was. But there's something beautiful about the way they kind of play with each other, and yeah, and knowing the history and how they like helped each other move forward in writing. I find that so fascinating.
A great book on this is Diana Gleyer's book called, what's it called? Oh boy. The Company They Keep, which is a really great look at the Inklings as a whole, as a collaborative group.
Mm,
It sort of takes the ways that the different metrics for measuring the ways that creative groups collaborate, and then applying it to the Inklings. And it's really interesting, and I think it's a good book for kind of disentangling, like, there's a lot of sort of like urban myths and stuff about the Inklings that have kind of popped up, and
mm,
this book is really good for kind of sorting through that stuff. There's a popularized version of it that she published a couple of years ago called Bandersnatch, which is fine, but really, if you can track down The Company They Keep, which is like the more scholarly version of the same thing, it's
mhm.
better. The footnotes are really great. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, yeah. Well, thank you for that introduction.
yeah.
That was super helpful for me, especially because I've seen you around, but I haven't watched a lot of the Universal history. I mostly get the Spark Notes from my husband, but I thought it would be really interesting to talk with you because you have this love for ancient texts
Hmm.
and understanding them, and I, as a filmmaker, am basically a trained person in the modern arts.
Yeah,
And I find this interesting. I find it interesting the way that they kind of intertangle. And so I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts of like how as modern people should we participate with like medieval or just these older works that have come before us, like ancient texts, as we're like moving forward to try create things for ourselves and make these sort of modern stories.
yeah. Man, that's a really good question. So the first thing I would say is that it's extremely important to go back and read primary sources as much as you can. I mean, if you want to do this seriously, um, you can start anywhere. This is the great thing about the great tradition, is that because everything is interlinked, and you shouldn't think of it even as a chain so much as a web, right? And so you have a web and kind of concentric circles of connections. So the things at the center of the web are more connected than the things on the periphery,
Hmm.
but everything is connected to multiple things. And so for the Middle Ages, So in the discarded image, Lewis lays out the kind of the four essential things he thinks that you need to read to understand the medieval West, which are the Holy Scriptures, Ovid's Metamorphoses, the Aeneid by Virgil, and then the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. And that these are the four kind of essential texts for understanding the medieval West. Now, as I mentioned, I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and so there is something a little bit different that happens in the East. Sometimes you might express it by saying the East never had a Renaissance, but it's actually more probably appropriate to say the East never had a Middle Ages. The East has a lot more continuity with the ancient world and sort of just saw themselves as continuing the Roman Empire, continuing the world of antiquity. The East never loses access to Homer, right? So the reason Homer is not on the list for the medieval West is that at some point people in the West stop having access to Greek texts and stop being able to read them.
Right.
And that never happens. That never happens in the East. You've always got access to Homer, and it continued to be used as an important part of, basically what we would refer to now as education, or as they called classical education, or as they called it back then, education. And
Yeah, they didn't need any
yeah,
qualifiers.
yeah. So the list for the East might be a little bit different, but my point is that there are certain works that are like linchpins, or the center of the web, where if you read and really kind of grapple with them, I mean, Lewis says of the Consolation of Philosophy, like to read this and love it is to become a naturalized citizen of the Middle Ages. Now, you notice that 3 out of those 4 that Lewis lists off for the Middle Ages in the West are all narratives. They're stories. The Bible is almost entirely stories and wisdom literature and poetry. There's almost no, in fact, I'd go as far to say, and maybe some, Reformed friends out there are going to differ with me on this, but I'd go so far as to say there's no systematic theology at all in the Holy Scriptures.
Mm.
You have epistles, which are written to people to address particular problems. And then you have what are essentially liturgical instructions and texts. You have the narrative, the story of how God saves and chooses and saves and leads and chastises and redeems his people, right? And then you have a lot of poetry. And that's really it. That's really what the scriptures are. And then, of course, Ovid's Metamorphoses and Virgil's Aeneid are both narratives, or in the case of Ovid, it's like a collection of narratives. So I say all of this to say that the things that are closest to the center of the web are usually not actually, you could say, like systematic works, but rather they tend to be works that actually, even the Consolation of Philosophy is laid out as a story, right? It is like a philosophical treatise, but it's laid out in the form of a story, in the form of a dialogue. So stories are the things that are close to the center of the web always tend to be stories. Which means that if you really dig into almost any medieval story, what you'll end up doing is pulling on these threads, all the other threads of the web that connect to other things. And so these are good places to start. I'm a huge fan of, in particular for me, probably the 2 most important things are the Beowulf poem and the Divine Comedy by Dante. And both of these stories are things that I've been doing like long form courses, like studies through. So if people, by the way, if you don't mind me mentioning, if people are curious about that and they want to go like really deep, like 18 hours on Beowulf, and by the time we're done, it'll probably be like 40 to 60 hours on Dante's Divine Comedy. You can go to symbolicworld.com/courses and you can sign up for those. We're about to start at the end of this month, we're going to be starting a class in Purgatorio, which is the second book of Dante's comedy. Which is a good example of how to tackle these kinds of stories, actually. So to go back to your original question, the question is like, how do we as modern readers, how do we go and how do we, tackle these kind of older stories? The first thing to understand is that medieval storytelling is not concerned with the same things that modern storytelling is. Modern storytelling, especially if we're thinking sort of like popular, like pop culture storytelling, which I'm generally a defender of the idea of pop culture, despite the fact that I am like a pretty snobby person by any measurement, right? the stories that I'm the most interested in are the ones that have the that the most people are interested in.
Yeah.
What I want to do is look at pop when I look at pop culture. I mean, yes, there are many things about it that you could wish were better or whatever, but the thing
Yeah.
that I'm really interested in is how is this shaping the imagination of the people who are reading it, and especially like young people. I was talking to somebody a couple of years ago and saying, we were talking about why is so much recent fantasy literature kind of rubbish, And we're talking about this, and I said, well, you got to understand that for most people, when they think of fantasy, what they're actually thinking of is like MCU films. They're not thinking of Tolkien or
Yeah.
Tolkien's older influences, right? They're thinking of an MCU film, and that's really
Right.
what they actually have in their head, and that affects the way, it affects the way that people play something like D&D. So
Yeah.
anyway, not to get too nerdy on your show here, but
No, no,
uh,
no. I'm very
yeah,
much enjoying it. And
yeah.
it kind of leads into my next question of, like, what do you think of modern films? There's a lot
Yeah.
of there's a
Well,
lot of talk about modern films.
let
Yeah,
me
go
come
ahead.
back around to that because that what let me finish saying what I wanted to say about
Yeah, go
how
for it.
we read medieval stories. So the first thing to understand is that medieval stories are not trying to do the same things as modern stories. So modern stories, if we look at pop culture and things like this, usually there's almost always, like a very tight arc, and in fact, if you watch a modern movie and it doesn't have like a sort of a tight character arc, like the, rising action, descending, denouement, like if you don't have that, then you'll usually kind of come away feeling very unsatisfied and be like, this wasn't a good story at all. If you take those expectations and you try to apply them to something like Sir Thomas Malory's The Morte d'Arthur, or some of the other medieval romances of Arthur, for instance, uh, you're going to be completely baffled. Not only will you not get something like a satisfying character arc most of the time, but you'll be very lucky if you're even able to follow one character. So medieval storytelling uses a lot of different kinds of structures that we're just not familiar with anymore. And to be frank, we typically don't have the attention span for anymore. So there's something called interlace, for instance, which interlace would be where you could say like you have four threads.
Hmm.
And then if you've ever looked at like Celtic knotwork, um, actually, I have a little bit. It's
Mm.
not Celtic knotwork, but I have like a little bit of interlace back here on the wall. But this is a very simple example. But if you look at like Celtic knotwork, it can be incredibly complex. Where you have strands dipping in and out of other strands, weaving in and out, and the actual task of trying to follow one strand from the beginning of the design to the end of the design is not just difficult. Often it's impossible because many of these designs are sort of circular, so they don't actually have a beginning or an end.
Hmm.
And that's actually the way that most medieval stories, just as a for instance, are structured. Now, I mentioned Purgatorio. Dante's Divine Comedy is a little bit easier in this sense because it does have, and you could make a case to say that the Divine Comedy is either the last medieval story or the first modern story, or maybe it's both, because it does kind of have you know, that you know you got a single character with a single plot that you can follow through on. But even then, Dante really subverts your expectations about what you think you're going to find in hell, what you think you're going to find in heaven, and what the conflict is, right? There's no monsters to actually fight
Hmm.
in the Divine Comedy, right? There's no big CGI fight scene at the end. There's just this progressive move towards holiness. And so I think that part of this just comes from the fact that more traditional ways of living kind of tended to lead more towards these thought patterns, and that people did have, especially in primarily oral storytelling cultures, did have the capacity to actually hold multiple threads in their minds. Like people had, in a certain sense, a better kind of memory for certain things, right? A better kind of attention span for certain things. So whereas you have to think of it like listening to Bach or something like that, where you have these themes that then get expanded, developed, and then eventually you return to the original theme sort of at the end. It's a little more like that. It's a little more like that. It's a little more like listening for music, listening for musical notes, and kind of listening to the way that those things play and interact. And I will just say, if anybody can ever successfully figure out how to do this in a modern storytelling context, it would be an incredible that would be an incredible step. It would be an incredible gift. If you could figure out how to take interlace, and I've seen some things that kind of move in this direction. Of course, none of them are mainstream, but I think if somebody could ever figure out how to do a really interlaced story on a kind of a popular scale, that would be a beautiful thing. And I think that in a lot of ways, I mean, this can transition into talking about modern, storytelling now if you want to. But I
Yeah.
think in a lot of ways we're kind of wounded by the spell that has been cast over us by the blockbuster as a concept. And now I mentioned I'm an apologist for popular culture, but to do that, I have to also be able to critique the things that are wrong with it.
Right.
So blockbuster culture, I think, casts this really potent spell where it doesn't just affect the it doesn't just affect the way that we how do I say this? It doesn't just affect like our taste or whatever, but actually it's got its own meta language, its own series of metaphors that it gives us to talk about storytelling, and which make it actually very difficult for us to talk about which make it very difficult for us to read and talk about these ancient and medieval myths and epics and so on. A good example is something I just did. I just said there's no big CGI fight scene at the end,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, that's a like a meta reference. That's not a reference to a specific film, right? I might have had a film in mind, but that's not a reference to a specific film, because every single one of these movies now has what, a sky beam, a red army, and a blue army, a big CGI fight scene, and we know what the beats are going to be. Like, we know exactly what to expect.
Mm.
And this is uh, and the thing that this sort of does is it kind of, I think it does kind of stunt the imagination, right? And we've got to, but I think that all the things that I've just mentioned, the Divine Comedy, the Arthurian stories, Beowulf, things like that. I mean, the thing to remember is that all of these things basically were popular fiction, right? This is stuff now, maybe like there was no such thing as like high fiction back then, right? Like a romance, which would be like which is what the medievals call a self-consciously fictional story. A romance was never, it's not like there was like literary fiction and then, I don't know, chewing gum fiction or whatever. Like there's uh so that's kind of like it's anachronistic to even throw these categories back at the past. But the thing that I'm trying to say is that um that there's just a lot of storytelling wisdom. I mean, one of my favorite examples in of this is in the Beowulf story, where there are no surprises in the Beowulf story, but Beowulf is full of surprises. So what I mean by this is, if you read the poem, you're always told exactly what's going to happen next. So one of the main things that modern storytelling relies on is suspense. This idea that I don't know what's going to happen next, and therefore I'm on the edge of my seat. Except that you always know what's going to happen next. If you've ever seen a
Yeah.
movie, in a genre, you know what's going to happen next. Like in a superhero movie or like in like a horror film or something like that, we know, like in a horror film, the jump scare is coming. And it's actually
Mm-hmm.
the anticipation of the jump scare that makes the jump scare work. Not, if you had never seen, well, I can't imagine, like existing in a vacuum where you never saw a horror film and then you went to see one. That's probably a recipe for madness. Like you have to be inoculated against these things a little bit. But but anyway, let's say that you have no idea what the conventions of a horror film are. Well, actually, a lot of the stuff in the movie just won't work on you, right? Because so there is a
Mm.
kind of a sense of expectation. So, but this is true in the Middle Ages as well. So what the Beowulf poet does is he always tells you exactly the outcome of the monster fights or whatever, and he uses a lot of interlace as well, by the way. So I'm just talking about the, let's say, like the A plot, but um but whenever it comes to the A plot, like he'll always tell you, Now Grendel is coming. Grendel doesn't know that this is his last night, at Heorot, because God has decided that he's going to die, right? He'll tell you these things. But then the fight between Beowulf and Grendel is still incredibly suspenseful. And the way that, but it's not a suspense of I don't know what's going to happen. It's a play on perspective. And so what the
Mm-hmm.
poet does then is actually he uh, as he starts out from Beowulf's perspective and then switches to Grendel's perspective and then back to Beowulf's perspective and back to Grendel's perspective. And then as you get the more important the fight becomes, like the more heated the battle becomes, the farther away your perspective becomes. And so then you get the perspective of the Yiddish retainers there in the hall, and then you get the perspective of the Danes who are outside, and all they can hear is the noise of the hall getting wrecked during the battle. At this point, you're like, okay, but actually, what's going on? And it's this beautiful way of creating this suspense and creating this sense of like actually making you really frustrated. Like I want to know what's happening in the action. It's kind of veiling, so to speak. So anyway,
Mm.
there are a lot of things like this in ancient storytelling that I think we could really benefit from bringing these things back into our popular culture and modern storytelling.
Well, where do you think modern storytellers fail the most in
Hmm,
in this area?
yeah, I think that modern storytellers, so much of modern storytelling, and this has always been true in the film industry, but the thing you have to remember is that film as a medium is quite young.
Yes.
Now, we're sort of making up for that by the sheer volume that we're cranking out, but if you compare it to other kinds of storytelling, like the oldest kind of storytelling, which is like the long form narrative poem, and or the novel, or fairy tales, folk tales, things like that, movies as such have not been around that long. And but because of the sheer number of resources required to make a film, I think the film industry has become increasingly risk averse. So this is thing one. I mean, this is really what to nerd out for a little bit. I'm a huge DC Comics fan. Been reading DC Comics since I was a little kid. Really upsetting to me what they did with the attempt to make a DC extended universe. Of course, they got on that train. First of all, 10 years too late. They as a friend of mine likes to say, everybody in Hollywood is always rushing to be second. So they got on that train like 10 years too late for one thing. But then when they did it, they tried to do a rush job and they didn't do it well. And part of the reason it didn't happen, it wasn't done well, is that there was a huge amount of risk aversion on the part of the studio, which
Mhm.
caused whatever creative vision the director and the artist involved might have had to be severely watered down. I mean, it's insane to me how much of a difference, and I'm not a filmmaker and I don't know the insides and the outsides of the industry, but I have some friends who are filmmakers, and it is insane to me how much of a difference there is between let's say like an edited and an unedited film,
Mhm.
to the point where it's almost basically a completely different piece of storytelling. And I've seen a couple of films before they were edited and then saw the edited, like the final proof. Like I have some friends who are indie filmmakers, and I was just like, this two completely different experiences. And some of that is sound design and everything, but also a lot of it is just selectively taking the portions, deciding what we to put out there. And this happened in the DCEU through so like there was the Justice League film that they tried to make, and the studio had become basically incredibly risk averse, and
Mhm.
so what they did was to bring in Josh Whedon because he'd done a lot of good numbers with the Avengers films, and try and basically halfway through they get rid of the previous director and they get Josh Whedon to come in, and Josh Whedon basically does some reshoots and then edits his own movie together, which was very bad. I mean, I think one of the worst superhero films ever made. And so there was this huge push for from the fans to release the Snyder Cut, which is the 4 hour something, insane runtime cut of the Justice League movie the way that Zack Snyder had intended it to be, which was pretty enjoyable for what it was. So I think risk aversion and the sort of like the decision making by committee, I think this is one of the things that really kills real storytelling efforts. And I don't know how you get past that in a pop culture, setting, obviously, because these studios, they want to make money. But then like the other thing that seems to be obviously a big problem at the moment, is the the kind of like the woke storytelling aspect, which is itself its own kind of risk aversion, right? But it's
Yeah.
yeah. But those are like sort of modern problems. But I think that to me, if I had to point to one thing, I would just say it's the over reliance on catharsis as the main sort of uh and here I'm just mainly thinking about
Mhm.
pop culture, right? The
Yeah.
over reliance on catharsis as the main sort of satisfaction you get from a story. And there are a lot of other sort of ancient storytelling tropes. There are other ways of giving satisfaction from a story, that and catharsis, like the let me watch somebody else's tragedy, or let me watch somebody else's, um uh kind of I feel like I'm losing the thread here, but anyway, that idea of like, let me experience some tragedy and some pain so that I feel a release, and I like that's fine. But a lot of ancient stories are not, they don't, I just, what I would like to see is playing around with some more forms, like some more of the different ancient forms.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult because filmmaking at its essence is a collaborative art form.
Yeah.
You can do it by yourself, but it's incredibly difficult and it's not actually that fun. It's much more fun if you can like have have the big sets.
Yeah.
There's certainly a fun to indie filmmaking because you're learning the craft on like a shoestring budget, and that
Yeah.
really teaches you how to be economical with what you shoot, and it kind of it teaches you too that sometimes the most beautiful thing is not the thing you planned. And
Hmm.
so when you get these unlimited resources, you kind of lean into the magic, the movie magic of that, of like allowing yourself to let go a little bit of the control and trust the people on the team who are part of
Yeah.
part of this like project, that they're going to add something good to that. And so it's very tricky. I don't know. I'm always torn with that because I'm a filmmaker. I would not say I'm necessarily a successful filmmaker, but I am a filmmaker trying my best to
Yeah.
figure out how do we do this thing sustainably?
Yeah.
How do we create something that is going to outlive us?
And that collaborative aspect, I think, is really important. And that's not what I mean when I'm talking about making a movie by committee. Like, it's very different
Yeah. Yes.
when you're working with other audiences, or even to take us back to it. I'm really uncomfortable talking about film because I know how little I know about it. But to take it back to like a more traditional storytelling uh, a place, which is a little more of my wheelhouse. Even if you think about like what's the most primal, basic kind of storytelling that there is, well, it'd be, you know, I think we all have this image in our mind of like cavemen sitting around a campfire, right? But actually, for the majority of human history, that's been the main way that people told stories.
Mm.
And they had stories that they remembered, and you would have like one guy who had a good voice or a good memory, right? And he would be sort of like the walking sort of access to stories, except that all the stories aren't really in his head, because um, he's interacting with the people around that campfire, or the people in that hall as he's playing his harp and singing the songs of the old heroes or whatever. He's interacting with them and kind of changing what he says and does based on the feedback that he's getting from his audience.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of storytelling, if you can do it, I have a friend, Dr. Martin Shaw, who this is his whole thing. And if you ever get the opportunity to go see him, just hear him tell the story in person. It's one of the greatest experiences you'll ever have. And you really kind of feel
Mm.
like, I mean, it doesn't matter where you are. We were in like a convention center in like suburban Florida, and it didn't matter. Like, it felt like we were back in the before times.
Mm.
And if you have somebody who's like really gifted in this way, then you can experience that. But you can also just do this with your kids or with your friends. And it takes a certain kind of humility to sit down around like a fire. We have a big fire pit in our yard, and we use it for this, like to sit around and like read something together, or sometimes sit down and like let's tell stories. And you just try to just like tell a fairy tale that you know, like off the top of your head, right? Most people really struggle with that at first, but it's a really eye-opening experience. And one of the things that you find in the Middle Ages, for instance, is when you have the skalds or the shops. These are the like the Old Norse or the Anglo-Saxon bards, basically, respectively. They would go from hall to hall, and they'd be singing essentially the same songs, telling essentially the same stories. But then they'd work in a little bit about, oh, I'm at so and so's hall and he's feeding me supper tonight. So I'm going to work in a little bit about his ancestors, right? And so you actually
Mm.
like, and so the story kind of like
Mm.
morphs and changes. And a lot of times, like when these stories get passed around like this, and then when they get written down is actually when like somebody hears it and writes it down. And so that's the version we have, but there are certain parts of the story you have to think this wouldn't have been exactly the same from night to night as this guy is kind of traveling from homestead to homestead, right? And
Yeah.
so anyway, I say all that to say I think the closer that you can tell stories, and this is what I was really trying to get at a minute ago, is to say that the storytelling that's happening with something like, the MCU or Amazon's Rings of Power show or something like this, it is too far away from if we think about like all the best stories, they're usually written for a particular audience, right? Like Tolkien writes The Hobbit for his sons. That's why there's no girls in The Hobbit,
Mm.
actually.
Mm.
But like Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, for his kids initially, right? And like it seems like all the best stories start out as really targeting a very particular audience. And I think that's the way, if somebody wanted to become a storyteller, that's the way you should do it, is you should find somebody in your life and write a story for them. And just be like, well, what do you like? What would you want to hear in a story? And begin by writing a story that really satisfies that person, not just yourself, but like that really satisfies or brings joy to that person or to like a small community. And then the weird thing is that the better you do that, the more appealing the story is to everybody else.
Yeah.
Whereas if you try
Yeah.
to make a story for everybody else, see, I'm coming around to it now. This is really what I was saying a minute ago. If you try to make a story that pleases everybody else, which is what I really mean when I talk about like storytelling by committee,
Mm.
then paradoxically, that story will usually not really please anyone,
Yeah, because it's too self-conscious.
right? Yeah, it's too self-conscious and it's too risk averse and it's too like all these other things. I to keep blathering on about pop culture, like the biggest movie in theaters right now is the new Deadpool and Wolverine movie,
Uh-huh.
which I have not seen, but I've seen some clips that people have shared online and whatnot, and uh, that film seems to be extremely self-conscious in the sense that it's trying to sort of like, haha, let's make fun of Marvel, let's make fun of superhero films as a genre and kind of what the industry has become over the last 20 years that we've been doing
Mm-hmm.
them and all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And it seems to kind of be like this idea that, hey, if we're self-conscious about this stuff, then it's okay. Like as long as we make fun of ourselves for doing it, it'll be okay. And my sense though is that while that might be really amusing in the moment, my sense is that that is not going to that's not a winning strategy.
Right.
Like it's just like the tongue's a little too much in the cheek.
Yeah.
And if you take like a parody and you make it actually, this is our biggest film, was a parody that we made of all of our other movies, then that's I think that is kind of the sign of a genre that is in decline.
What do you think the difference is between self-aware and self-conscious?
Mm. It's a banger of a question. You can't just throw that at somebody, you know. Well, look, if I say that I'm self-aware, then it means that I know my weaknesses and that I have like certain problems that I need to work on, and it means that I can hear myself when, for instance, I'm just kind of blathering on with no end in sight. I'm like, okay, I need to, you really got to wrap this up, Richard. Like you're talking too much. Or like you're self-aware that the certain things you do kind of rub people the wrong way. And so you try to limit those things when you're around those people or things like that. That's self-awareness. I would say self-consciousness is sort of the opposite, actually, at least in terms of effect, because self-awareness, when it's healthy, is a kind of humility. And it's just sort of a, to quote a much older film than any of the ones we've discussed already, it's important for a man to know his limitations. If you if you uh, if you have a self-awareness of just saying, these are my limitations, this is as far as I can go, this is as much as I can do, and you're able to see that about yourself, then you'll mediate your relationships, your personal interactions will all be kind of mediated in a certain way through that lens. And it'll mean that you have the humility to actually enter into friendship, the humility to enter into a relationship, and so on.
Mm.
Self-consciousness is not humility, it's really a kind of pride, where you're just always hyper focused on yourself and the way that you're being perceived. And in the sense of in this and so it's a good distinction in the sense of like filmmaking, you could make, like you could say, like a self-aware superhero film. Good example of this. I didn't know I was going to talk about superhero films today, but it's that I mean I love superheroes as a genre. It's one of my very favorite things, and I rarely get the chance to talk about it. So thank you for indulging me.
Yes, of course. No,
Um,
I find all of this interesting. I love pop
a
culture.
great example. Yeah,
Yeah.
go
I
ahead.
think I also think it's interesting. I share that love
Yeah,
with you. So
yeah.
don't feel like you're blabbing on. I'm
A,
I'm
a, a
tracking.
great example of a self-aware superhero film is Batman Begins, which is essentially a perfect film, at least in the superhero genre. Um, it's very aware of what are the tropes, what are the stereotypes, what does the like, how do we explain, for instance, this idea of I'm going to dress up in Halloween costume and jump across rooftops, which is on the face of it kind of a silly proposition. And so it's aware of that, and it does use, there's some like sort of a little bit of deprecating humor now and then at when Liam Neeson's character is like, oh, I see you took theatrics a little too literally or whatever, like when they meet at the end. um and so there's kind of like a self-awareness of what the genre requires. Like the genre really does require a mask, or a costume. I'm super irritated whenever somebody makes a superhero movie, or it seems like in the early 2000s, because there was Heroes, and there were like a bunch of other, I think it was like Six or something, I forget what that one was called. But anyway, like Alphas, I was called Alphas. Yeah. So I love superheroes and shows with people with superpowers, and so whenever a new one comes out, I'm like, my wife and I were like, oh, we gotta check this out. And then I'm almost always irritated, because what they'll be like is, all right, guys, everybody's got superpowers, but now we're wearing slacks and hoodies. Isn't that edgy? And by the way, the slacks and hoodies aesthetic is the worst thing that's ever happened to filmmaking. I just hate it so much. But anyway, um, the even the fantasy genre, like I don't know if you saw Guy Ritchie's King Arthur film, and there was also like a Robin Hood that they did recently with what's his name, but
Yeah.
everybody's basically wearing slacks and hoodies, and it's somehow I'm supposed to believe this is middle age. It's just so aggravating. But anyway, it's sort of like there was like this great era of sword and sandal flicks, of which Gladiator is like the last good one. Well, there was also a slacks and hoodie era, and it's not my favorite thing. But anyway, so the genre really does require a mask and a costume, and there's something about what it means to be a superhero that if you don't have that, you're not really doing a superhero story. And so Batman Begins is
Mm.
self-aware of this, right? And so it comes up with, what's the explanation? How do we get to there? Like in a way that seems like it's realistic, or realistic is a bad word, but like in a way that's believable, like something the audience can buy into. the genre requires these things. What are the things Batman has to have? Well, he's got to have the suit, he's got to have the Batmobile, he's got to have Alfred, like the sort of things that the genre requires. It's self-aware of those things, but then builds out using that self-awareness actually in a kind of a humble way, builds a framework that is really convincing and makes for a great movie and a really great franchise. I mean, I enjoyed all three of the Dark Knight films. Even the last one, which some people didn't like so much, I really enjoyed. And I thought that actually the thing that people were the most irritated by was the fact that the franchise had an end, which that Batman, hung up the cape, passed it on to somebody else, retired. He's off somewhere living his best life, hobbling around on one bad knee, but living his best life nonetheless. And a lot of people were really irritated by that. I liked it because I already kind of foresaw what was going to happen if these movies just went on forever, which is the situation that we're in now. I'm on the phone. Close the door, buddy. Sorry. You have to edit that out.
No, that's okay.
Um,
I usually keep that stuff in. The
yeah,
last time
yeah,
I talked to Andrea, her kids came in like 3 or 4 times. And
yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
it's part of it. That's,
yeah, that's part of
yeah.
it. Yeah. So that's kind of my that's what I would define as like self-awareness. So then self-consciousness would be when you kind of know that things have gotten out of control, but and you're basically like doing damage control, which is to me, at least the clips I've seen, again, I haven't seen the movie and I probably won't see it while it's in the theaters, but to me that's what I see in that. And I think a lot of people feel like, okay, Deadpool's going to save the MCU, but like the thing you have to understand is Deadpool is he's a jester, right? And
Mhm.
he's a jester figure, and he's fine on the margins, but if he becomes the like, if he ever becomes the tentpole for your franchise has lost, you know,
The plot.
it's hard. Like it's lost its heart, it's lost its, everything that's like good and redemptive about the genre, and then all you're left with is all these little these broken fragments. Yeah. So
So do you think that Marvel does the stories better than DC?
huh. I think that the first couple of phases, I mean, there were some duds in there, but the first couple of phases of the MCU were really great. The Captain America trilogy in particular
Mm.
is incredibly strong, I think. Um, yeah, I really enjoy it. Um, there's there's I think that they haven't really made any good movies since Endgame.
Mm.
I haven't seen a single one of them that I really just was like, that was a good comic book movie since
Mm.
Endgame. And even like parts of Endgame where obviously like you could tell the direction things were already going, but you're sticking it out because gosh darn it, I've been invested in this for 18 years. Like I just got to see how it ends. But you could always already kind of see the direction things were going. And I feel like the people involved could see that as well, right? You sort of get the sense, even that last big battle and Endgame, it's just like, oh no, there's too much happening now, and we have to like make some kind of like a feeble gesture towards like girl power, and like all this stuff. And it's like the thing that Marvel did well when they were doing it well was the slow build, right? Where they actually managed to do something a little like that interlace structure that I was talking about, where you had stories that wove in and out of each other in a very compelling way. And they were able to hold that together for a while, much longer than I think really anybody was expecting, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
But now I feel like the thread, like all the threads are frayed, right? And they know this, and they're trying to inject new life into the franchise by bringing in the multiverse, which certainly is an important concept in comics. Like, really, you don't have comics since the late 80s. You just don't have comics without the concept of a multiverse. So that's fine as far as it goes. But whenever you fall back to the multiverse to like bring some new life in, because it lets you basically like play paper dolls with your characters, where you can be like, okay, but what if Captain America was a woman played by Haley Atwell? Well, actually, that's a fun idea, and everybody would like to see that. Whenever you go to the multiverse and whenever you lean on it, it's a way of like leaning on chaos. And so like the more of it you bring in, the more your world and your storytelling starts to fray apart. I think it'd be very difficult. I mean, if you take one of those movies from the first few phases of the MCU, let's say you take somebody who's never seen a Marvel movie before and you sit them down in front of Captain America 2, right, which is the Winter Soldier one, right?
Hmm.
But even like by itself, if you have no other frame of reference, it's still just a really fun, basically a spy flick, right? It's a really fun action movie. You can enjoy it. There's some good storytelling beats. If you take the same person and you put them down in front of, the new Deadpool movie, which has, I think by some counts, the most cameos that any modern film has ever had,
Mm.
right? And you put them down in front of that. Well, somebody who's like an insider is gonna be like, oh look, and it's ooh, right? And somebody with no frame of reference at all for this, it's just gonna be a blur. It's just gonna be a bunch of blob with, a giant blob with a very, very little in terms of actual storytelling happening.
Mm.
So that's kind of my feeling, is that I really feel like they have kind of lost the thread. They've lost the sense of what made things really good, but there are people who are there just trying to sort of milk it for as much money as they can still get out of the franchise. And I think they're trying to right the ship, trying to bring back Robert Downey Jr., trying to like, and we'll see what happens. I'm not hugely optimistic though. So
Mm. Well, you've mentioned orthodoxy a couple times.
hmm.
Where do you think the Orthodox Church um, has a place in that kind of orientation of telling better stories?
Ooh, I think there is something happening right now with a lot of Orthodox people involved. I mean, us here at Symbolic World, but other places as well, in kind of trying to do a return to more traditional storytelling forms, but in a modern context. Jonathan Pageau is doing this with his fairy tales, and Father Deacon Nicholas Kotar, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has done this with some of his fantasy writing, and I think there's other really good stuff to come. What Orthodoxy could give the artist or could give the storyteller. I mean, the first thing is to say that Orthodoxy has never really self-consciously pushed the development of fiction, right? The way that, yeah, well, Christianity as a rule doesn't do that actually, but it encourages it by making space for it. So in Orthodoxy, we have a huge focus on the icon, the role of the icon.
Mm-hmm.
And you get this for instance, in St. John of Damascus, his treatise on the holy images. What St. John says is that the reason it is acceptable not just to make, but to kiss a picture of Christ. And
Mm-hmm.
the kissing is actually very important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, the reason that St. John of Damascus says that this is an acceptable thing to do, not just acceptable, but actually necessary, it's a necessary thing to do, is because God became matter. And by becoming matter, right, taking on, a full human nature with all of its implications, by becoming matter itself, like its fundamental nature as a potential medium for God's grace, that is for God's life, has been revealed.
Mm-hmm.
And so this starts to affect the way that we tell. It affects, first of all, like art. And one of the things that St. John says, by the way, says, if you're going to get rid of the icons, you may as well get rid of the incense and the beautiful lights and the chanted music and all of the other parts of worship, because all of these things involve matter. And I'm like, you're weirdly anticipating my childhood, St. John. Like, it's very uncomfortable to me, you know. But
Well, can you go a little deeper
yeah,
on that? Like, what
sure.
is your background? Because I know I've heard
Yeah,
a
of
little bit of
course.
it. I listened
Yeah,
to your conversation with Paul Vanderklay. Well,
yeah,
I think you've had a couple of them. So I've
yeah.
listened to, I don't know if I've listened to all of them,
That
but I've
that first
definitely
that
listened to
first one we
some.
did, the first one we did a little while back is the deepest I've ever gone in a recorded way into talking about my background. But essentially, I grew up in the South, basically a fundamentalist Baptist, which meant that we were heavily involved in the worship wars in like the 80s and 90s. For people who don't know, this is like the question: are you going to use piano and organ and sing out of a hymn book, or are you going to have a praise band up on the stage? And we are very much piano and organ kind of
Hmm.
people, which I'm grateful for, by the way. Like I would still prefer that personally. If I had to choose to go back to Protestant worship, which is not something I want to do, but if I were, that's what I would go back to that. But um, uh, and so, but it was very much a background that had no room for beauty expressed in any. Now there's an asterisk next to this because I came from a very musical family, so there was always the sense that music, like beautiful music, like you could like play an amazing piano solo for church or something like that, that is fine, but that any kind of physical, and physical is the wrong word here because music is physical. It's, the piano is physical, the sound waves are moving the air in a physical way, which is moving my eardrum, which is sending signals to my brain. All of that stuff is actually part of your body.
Right.
And the fact that there is this sort of weird thing that sometimes exists in like a Protestant context where you're like, visual things, those could be idolatrous, but sound is fine, right? A great sermon, there's no way a great sermon could ever be idolatrous. And actually, there have been like, in like hyper consistent Protestants who tried to say, like for instance, Oliver Cromwell burned all of the organs and all the organ music in England. This is why there are no organs from before the English Civil War, because he had them all burned because he said, nah, beautiful music that could be idolatrous, right? In Baptist history, in the early history of Baptists in the United States, there was something called the singing controversy, and which is basically an argument about whether or not it was even appropriate to sing music in church, because a beautiful, sung piece of music could itself be idolatrous. So there's this fear of beauty that really kind of defines, for me, that's the defining feature of fundamentalism. I am sometimes accused, because I do believe in things, and I believe the dogmas of the Orthodox Church. I'm a catechist. I serve in my parish. I make no bones about, listen, if it's a dogma of the Orthodox Church, I'm going to teach it to you. That's my job here, is to transmit the tradition to you. So because of this, sometimes I'm accused of being a fundamentalist. But for me, the thing that really defines fundamentalism is a deep suspicion of beauty. That's the thing, like having grown up in it, that's the thing that really defines it for me. Um, I don't think that just because you have like strong moral fiber or deeply held convictions or whatever that you're necessarily a fundamentalist. There's something about fundamentalism that says, no, we have to be suspicious of all of this stuff because the stuff is extra, and what you need to get to is your fundamentals, right? And so that was my experience of it, and that's really what, when I say fundamentalism, that's what I mean, is this is the fear of stuff, or the fear of beauty, or the fear of the things in the world that you can't totally control and predict, right? And there is that thing about beauty. There's a reason like all artists are like insane people, right? Like
Yeah.
because there is like sometimes, to be really receptive to beauty, you have to open up in certain ways, and sometimes if you don't have the right kind of guidance and there's a variety of life and everything else, then that can be kind of a dangerous thing to do. But so I say all this to say that I think that what Orthodoxy has to really offer the world in this sense is actually the right way to encounter and know what is beautiful. And that we get this through our theology of the icon, which then leads us by extension to say we have to have the most beautiful worship possible. And so while you do see, Orthodox missions start in storefronts or warehouses or whatever all the time, it's a pretty normal thing, especially here in the South where Orthodoxy is growing rapidly. We need new parishes sooner than we can build a beautiful temple. But everybody sort of understands that as soon as you have the means, one of the first things you have to do is to build a beautiful place to worship. Because that beauty is part actually of what mediates the encounter with God. And so by extension, when St. John and the other church fathers are defending the use of icons, they're not just defending icons, they're actually defending the whole idea of embodied beauty in worship. And I think that it's not too much of a stretch to then apply that by extension to storytelling. Tolkien says, you go ahead.
Well, I won't derail your thought, but I'd love to kind of hear. I heard in one of your conversations you were talking to Paul, you talked about the idea of like people being icons and basically the human being like the whole cosmos
That's right.
in one. Can you kind of explain that
Yeah.
in the way that that then shapes the way we should see stories and like our lived
So
experience?
this is this ancient idea of man as microcosm. Microcosm would be like, it doesn't mean it literally means like a small universe. But really what you should think of is like a series of fractal patterns where if you look at a human being, actually the human being has everything in him that the universe also has. And that the pattern of a human being is also the pattern on which the cosmos is laid out. Actually, I try to normally avoid saying the word universe, by the way. I try to use the word cosmos, which is a more Christian word. But anyway, um, that's a discussion for maybe another time. But the 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 way that the cosmos lays itself out, the way that the world is, that it exists, is the same way that you exist as a human being. And this is because the cosmos was made by a man, right? The Son of Man, Jesus Christ,
Hmm.
who's the, in some mystery, he's you could say like incarnated before he creates the world. And I'm not speaking like according to like human understandings of time, but this idea that he's the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, right? Um, that his is the perspective, you could say, by which the cosmos exists. And there are a lot of beautiful representations of this in like Orthodox theology and iconography and so on. But that's the basic idea. And so what we would say, and there's a reason the Orthodox Church is set, and this really offends some people on the internet right now. But the Orthodox Church, in the what's called the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Nicaea, was a council where it was actually between two really ugly periods of iconoclasm. And you have to understand, people weren't just going around smashing the icons. People who hid the icons in their homes were being tortured and sometimes killed. We have
Hmm.
more martyrs and confessors on our calendar from the like in the Orthodox Church, from the iconoclastic period than we do from the Great Persecution under Diocletian, right? Which is like up till then had been the worst period of persecution that the church had endured. And this was persecution coming from people who themselves actually claimed to be Christians. But if you had a picture of Christ or of Mary or of the saints, or sometimes even something as simple as like a cross in your home, you'd be dragged down the streets, you'd be beaten, sometimes you'd be killed or executed or tortured or whatever else.
Hmm.
And so these are really dark and ugly periods in our history. This happened in the East, which is sort of like ground zero for Orthodoxy.
Hmm.
And so in between these two iconoclastic periods, and ultimately the church triumphed over this heresy. And the triumph begins at the second Council of Nicaea, but then actually following that, there's another period of iconoclasm that then eventually is also defeated. But at the Second Council of Nicaea, what the church said was that not only are icons acceptable for Christians to venerate, but actually, if you refuse to venerate an icon, you're not a Christian. Now,
Hmm.
again, a lot of people, a lot of people are like really, really offended by that.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's fine. I get it. But you have to, I think, partially like understand this thing, in the context of the time. Like, there's no Protestant Reformation at this point. But also, like, I think that I mean, I'll just say, I don't mind saying that, if you're a Protestant who sees a picture of Jesus and says, I should burn that, you should really think hard about like what religion you're a part of, because that's not a feature of Christianity, that's a feature of Islam.
Do you
So
do you
yeah,
think The Chosen is a kind of icon?
that's an interesting question. So I'm not a huge fan of The Chosen, but it's not because it's not because I think it's like sinful to make a movie like a TV series about Christ. But the Chosen is an interesting question because I have Protestant family members who would never have an icon of Christ in their house. They would just never do it. But they have like framed pictures of like the actor who plays Jesus in The Chosen because it came with their special edition Chosen DVDs, and isn't this so cool? And I'm like, why do you think you want that? Why do you think you want that? Because naturally, like the idea of like having somebody that you love, and I really do believe that these family members really love Christ, to have a picture of somebody you love is just a very natural kind of a human thing. It's a natural human desire. And what the Christian faith says is actually there's nothing wrong with it. And so But
Yeah.
the reason to kind of go back to the other reason why we've said, actually, if you refuse to venerate an icon, you're not a Christian, is because the thing that you have to come to, and this is what St. John of Damascus says, and what the other church fathers who defended the icon said, is the fact that because of the incarnation, the relationship with human nature and with the human person and with the whole cosmos has been radically changed. And so if I can't in this, even in this conversation right now, see you as an icon of Christ, right? If I can't see the homeless guy
Mhm.
who hits you up for, $2 because he's got to get on a bus to Houston to see his son literally every day for the last 3 years, like telling you that, like, if I can't see him as an icon, if I can't see the people who voted for the wrong guy last election, if I can't see them as an icon, right, as actually a way of seeing them as human beings who actually bear a Christ image and therefore are worthy of my love and even veneration. If I can't see them for that, then I have failed as a human being.
Yeah.
Right? And this is what St. John has in mind when he says, if you hate your brother who you have seen, how can you say that you love God who you've not seen?
Hmm.
Right? But sort of by extension, you could say, like, if you hate the icon of Christ that you have seen, right, whether it's a person or whether it's a painted image, if you just look at that and you say, I hate this, then how can you say that you love God?
Mm.
And so that's kind of the idea. That's why the church said what it did. But to kind of, I'll pause in case you want to ask something about that, and then I'll try to tie this into storytelling.
Well, I just kind of want to hear your thoughts on the divine feminine
Yeah.
because, I came from a Protestant background.
Hmm.
I think the best way to describe it is probably non-denominational evangelical
Yeah.
Christian. So like a Bible church.
Yeah.
But there was this sort of hesitancy against iconography, especially Mary.
Yeah.
Like
Of course.
we had a lot of like respect for Jesus and what he did.
Hmm.
But yeah, there was that kind of the image of it. It was like this recognition of like, we don't do that because we are. But I've become Orthodox in the last couple of years. And yeah, I've had a similar situation where all of a sudden the like I've been enchanted into like seeing the world in this way that makes more sense than the thing that I was given growing up, even though the thing that I was given growing up made a lot of sense to me and I never
Of
abandoned
course.
it. It just was
Of
like
course.
this like deeper sense. And so we talk a lot about Christ in Protestantism, but there's almost a hesitancy to talk about Mary. I wonder
I mean, it's
why that is. Yeah.
if all you encountered was hesitancy, then you had a great experience. I had my upbringing, there was like outright hostility. Like they would preach a sermon against Mary at least once a year.
Yeah, I mean, it
You know?
flirted with hostility, but it was always
Yeah,
sort of self-conscious
yeah,
enough to be like,
yeah, yeah,
like it was, yeah, the non-denominational sense is so open, it doesn't have any boundaries.
right, right,
So
right,
there's
right.
that sense of like, even if you have a hostility to something, there's always this openness of like, maybe I'm wrong,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good thing to be able to say. Um, yeah, I mean, to me, the act of storytelling itself is bound up with her. And so we have this back before COVID, we were doing this kind of Tolkien reading day event in Dallas at my parish called Lady Moot, which was originally
Lady
because
mood,
Lady Moot. So
moot. Oh,
a moot is like a meeting, right? Like an ent moot. Um, just more nerd stuff for your channel. It's gonna be the nerdiest episode you've ever had.
that's okay. I
Um,
like it.
yeah. Uh, uh, so a moot is like a meeting, and then in Old England, the Feast of the Annunciation, March the 25th, used to be called Lady Day. So the idea
Hmm.
is we'd meet together like after church on the Feast of Annunciation, and we would really do some like readings and usually have like a guest speaker and things like this. It was really there's kind of like a running sort of gag almost of Tolkien conferences like being called something moot. So like the big one at Oxford every year is Oxen Moot, and so on. So hence the Lady Moot. And the idea was like a Tolkien reading day thing that was also on the Feast of the Annunciation. The Feast of the Annunciation is the the most depicted work of moment in the scriptures. It's the most common in all of Western art. It's the most depicted scene other than the crucifixion, like across sacred, secular, anything else. Like there have been more paintings of the Annunciation than any other single moment in history. And the reason for this is because it is the moment when the highest thing becomes lowest. The only other thing that you could possibly say comes close to that is the crucifixion, right? Right. So in this moment where the highest thing becomes lowest, and the God uh, who constantly hides himself in the womb of a young Jewish girl. I mean, this
Mm-hmm.
is, and I think that the sort of like the main juice of storytelling, that the main thing that makes stories work is paradox.
Yeah.
And if I wanted to like really diagnose even a little deeper what's wrong with modern storytelling, is that we've lost our capacity. This is a better way than trying to say what I was saying about catharsis earlier. We've lost our capacity to embrace paradox, to the point that like there's very few modern storytelling efforts you could point at that are even comfortable with the idea of paradox, let alone sort of let it play.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this moment, in this very paradoxical moment, you have everything, like the highest possible thing. You have the entire cosmos, you have whatever, however you want to express it, is like all gathered into like a single cell, right? Into like the tiniest possible point. Not, of course, like in Christian art, we don't show the cell, we just show the woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
We show the because the you could say the natural level of the universe is personhood. So for traditional ways of talking about things, if you're going to talk about the cosmos, you have to talk about it as a person. For when it comes to somebody like you or somebody like me, what we don't want to do is break down you past your personhood to talk about just your brain or just your foot or just your whatever. And if we do that, then the only way we can really get away with it is by personifying those things a little bit. St. Paul does this, like, will the hand say to the eye, I have no part of you or something? Well, obviously these things don't have mouths. How would they be talking to each other? But what he's doing is personifying those things. So what I mean, so the natural level of language, the natural level of experience of the cosmos is always the level of the person. So that's why it goes to her. And the thing to understand is that Christianity is not primarily a collection of dogmas. It is a web, like a spider web, of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And when people say things like, oh, it's not a religion, it's a relationship, first of all, the word religion literally means a formalized relationship. So that irritates me. But you could say this about Orthodoxy if you wanted to, because really for us, it's about a relationship. And so we would never just say there's this idea called the Incarnation that you need
Mm-hmm.
to know about. What we'd say is the Incarnation happened through a particular person and you need to know her.
Mm.
And so this, if you can grasp this, St. John of Damascus again, he says, the whole mystery of the economy of our salvation is contained in the word Theotokos.
Mm.
Like if you can understand what would it mean for a human woman to be the mother of God, then you would understand everything about our salvation. Of course, you can't understand that. Um, it's a mystery, like it's a something that's beyond our ability to fully comprehend. What would that mean? What are all the implications? But really, the last 2,000 years of our church's life have been about unfolding that and unpacking that. And so I think that the Theotokos as the way in which God becomes embodied, as the way in which like logos is given its body, as the place in which um, as the place in which things that are abstract become concrete, like all these different ways that you could say of talking about her. Because of this, I think the idea of the feminine or the divine feminine or whatever you want to call it is really essential to the well, it's essential to the whole idea of the icon, right? The idea that human beings, let alone matter like wood and paint or whatever, could become a means of transmitting grace, right? She's the first example of that, right? Not really the first example because you have all these Old Testament shadows and types, but she's the thing that all of those things are about. The ark, the tabernacle, those are actually about her, right? And the way that she gives
Mm.
a body, like becomes the dwelling place of God. And so this is what I think Orthodoxy sort of has the ability to bring to the table, is that Christianity in the West, and here, unfortunately, you have to say, even our Roman Catholic friends very often, I mean, there are these really dispiriting polls and things like this about the, um, like the decline of Roman Catholic belief in the Eucharist. And I know they're trying hard to address this right now with like the Eucharistic revival stuff they're doing. I wish them nothing but, success with all of this. But with a decline of a, oh, sorry, hold on. All right, so uh, for people listening along at home, I had to step away to deal with an electrician who's over and kind of lost my train of thought a little bit. But let me just try to tie it back into the question of the divine feminine. I think that storytelling is uh, to put this in symbolic terms, storytelling is a masculine act which requires the feminine.
Hmm.
So what I mean by this is that storytelling is it's the taking of the logos, right? That you have like the logos of your story, and then you have to put it into something and give it body, right? And so that act of embodiment is itself something that requires the feminine, otherwise it just doesn't really work. And so this is the difference between who out there has ever had just like, I have a neat idea for a story, and then it just never really takes any kind of a form. You never get that novel written, so basically what you have is like all masculine and there's no feminine.
Mm.
And this is a problem with Western Christianity in general, particular Protestantism in this regard, right? Yeah, so this is what I was trying to say a moment ago, is that I think that that Orthodoxy um, has still a really deep sense of a sacramental imagination. Because of our theology of the icon, there is the capacity to kind of apply the ramifications of the Incarnation to forms of human artistic endeavor,
Uh-huh.
and that makes it that makes us, I would say actually kind of uniquely equipped to answer to this moment if we can do it. And there are other things that go into this, like raw talent and hard work and other things. So I'm not just saying that any Orthodox Christian is going to be a good storyteller by default, but I think that the failure of the sacramental imagination and the sort of seeding of the space of storytelling, sorry about all the noise in the background, the seeding of the space of storytelling to the world and to like a kind of a secular world that has lost the capacity for enchantment and
Mm.
imagination is part of why we're in the situation that we're in today. If you can look at if you look at our um, if you look at our political situation in the United States, a lot of people talk about the culture wars, but it's not really a war between culture anymore because, first of all, nobody really has culture anymore.
Right.
But
Right.
culture, right, would indicate like cultus. It would indicate that there was something that people were coming together around, to like actually venerate or worship in a formal way. That's what you
Mhm.
have to have for culture. But it's not really a culture war; it's a war of imaginations.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that this maps to like some kind of a political divide. What I'm saying is that the because I don't think it does. I think that the war against this hellish imagination is has to be waged on both sides of the aisle.
Mm.
But I think there's a because we've lost this capacity, right, to, you could say, like, to see and hold things as sacred on the one hand, which is the sin of the left, right? The sin of the left is the inability to see a place or a person as being sacred, as of the inability to see certain things as being sacrosanct. Um, and in that sense, leftist ideology in the United States is just as far downstream from Puritanism as the right is. And then
Mm.
on the right, there's another kind of a failure or another kind of a sin, which you could say is something like, the inability to see the human person. Well, but both right and left fail in the ability to see the human person as icon, right? In these, kind of different ways. But I think that
Mm.
I think that sin or that failure, it manifests in kind of different ways depending on maybe what your political ideology and your outlook is. And I think that we've the real war is for the imagination. It's for your capacity to see the
Mm,
world in this way. And that's why I love
yeah.
Tolkien. That's why I like good stories. That's why pop culture is important to me, because pop culture is where the war for the imagination is being waged.
Right. Do you know Tim Mackey at all?
No, I'm sorry.
No, he does like the Bible Project. Have you heard of that?
I'm familiar with the Bible Project. To be honest, despite the fact that I'm like, online a lot, I don't really actually like I'm not online a lot. That's the thing. Like I have conversations like this, but I don't really listen to a lot or watch a lot. I've got 5 kids and really busy work life and parish life and everything else. And that kind of like keeps me busy. So
Yeah,
I feel like
100%.
I feel like I'm never really up on what's going on, but I am aware of the Bible Project.
Yeah. Well,
And
I
and
only say that.
I've only heard good things.
Well, I
Yeah.
only say that because I sort of credit Tim Mackey for becoming Orthodox because
Yeah. Yeah.
he he I don't know, he like animated my world in this
Yeah.
way through
Yeah.
his animations,
Through his
through his like,
animations. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's not his necessarily, like he's sort of like the mind behind it, right? He does a lot
Yeah.
of like the
Yeah.
research and the study, but then he's
Yeah.
created this team that
Yeah.
um, they do such beautiful things. And I actually, I had to go to, for one of my films that I was making, I had to go to Portland to like interview a friend about
Yeah.
her experience with restaurant work. Or, well, it was actually, she in Seattle or Portland? Well, I went to Seattle for a restaurant and then I went down to Portland after to interview my friend. But it was kind of just an excuse to go to Portland so that I could take a tour of the Bible Project. It was like this little pilgrimage where it was like going in and like feeling like you got to, how do you say it? Like see a world that like was enchanted.
Yeah. I've heard
uh,
other people say this before, that watching that program also helped them to become Orthodox. So I think that this is the best gift as a storyteller you could give somebody,
I
is that
agree.
whenever the credits close or the story finishes or you close the book, that they walk out into the world and have the capacity to see it in a better way, in a more salvific way than how they saw it before.
Yeah. And okay, here's the second question. Do you know Sarah Sparks?
I don't.
Okay, so Sarah Sparks is she's a musician. She's my favorite musician. She writes beautiful things, but she wrote a whole album of, of songs based on the Chronicles of Narnia,
No, interesting.
and they're the most beautiful songs in the world. And
No.
yeah, it like I think that for me, like the minute I engaged with her work, it opened me up to like getting outside of my head and this like war that was in my head and
Mm,
moved it into like realizing the true reality of like what I thought I was meant to be, which was like to be this weird like quirky artist who brought people together to make fun things, you know?
yeah.
And so yeah, I just love the beauty of the way those things work, and I love the way that Orthodoxy has like through the images and through the structure, because it's very demanding, Orthodoxy, in this weird way that's hard to kind of describe it, because it's like,
Yeah.
what's the demanding part? Oh, I have to stand during the
Right.
service. I
It's
have
all
to
really
not eat
embodied stuff.
oil. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like
Yeah.
how is that, like when I was first coming to Orthodoxy, I'm like, am I missing something? Like I have to stand. That's the hard thing. But then when you go through it, it's all of a sudden like it's this really hard thing, and then you kind of push through, and then it's
Yeah.
like it unlocks this world. And
Yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, it's very interesting. But anyways, I don't remember exactly why I was bringing that up, but it
We're
reminded
just
me.
talking about the capacity of an artist to change your imagination, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
and that's the questions that I'm starting to like wrestle with. It's like um, I'm a Christian, right? So like I see my world through that lens, but I'm
Yeah.
also an artist, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of have trouble being like I'm a Christian artist, because what does that fully
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And
Well,
and
there's so
like
much evangelicalism is given that idea, like I think so much baggage. I mean, when I was in my previous life on staff at at this Baptist church, um that's right when like the Sherwood pictures, people like facing the giants and War Room and all that stuff were like
hmm
first having a really big blow up,
yeah.
and I can't remember the Courageous Dads movie or whatever it was called. I forget what that one was called. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Fireproof, was that that one?
Fireproof.
Yeah, there are
Fireproof
all
was
these
one of them.
PureFlix
Yeah,
ones. I
yeah, yeah,
lived
yeah,
in Arizona. I
yeah.
lived in Arizona, which is where like PureFlix is located.
Oh,
And
okay, yeah,
actually, my parents were friends with Sean Bosky, who was one of like the
oh wow,
guys who like runs
yeah.
PureFlix. So I've had a conversation with him
So
before.
I sort of hate, by the way, like the whole idea of PureFlix, or at least the whole idea of like those those filters that will like take all the language and the nudity out of a movie or whatever to make it sanitized. And the reason that I hate that idea is because it means like I sort of feel like if you're gonna watch the movie, you should just commit to it. That's thing number one. But the second thing is like you need to think about like, wait a minute, is there a reason people with my convictions shouldn't be making movies like this? Like and like actually wrestle with that question. And this sort of like
Yeah.
keeps you from having to have that difficult conversation with yourself. But anyway, sorry, you were saying something about
Well, no, that's the,
yeah,
that. I think you're exactly right because that's
yeah,
the thing I've been wrestling for the last
yeah,
probably decade of like how do you be a Christian? How do you be an artist and how do you integrate those things without being a label of like a Christian artist?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
at
yeah,
this certain point, it's like, yes, I'm a Christian and that defines so much of my worldview, but that's like something so much bigger than a label that you can put on it. Like it's not a marketing term. It's like a lifestyle. And
yeah,
so, like I always kind of cringe at that idea of like, oh, I'm a Christian filmmaker, even though it's like, well, that is technically true, but you don't just want to make uh, films that are sermons. You want to make films that a preacher could watch and say, oh, that's how life really is,
yeah.
if that makes any sense.
I think that that sense of like this is how life is or how it should be. Like that's if I tell a story that's and most of the like the storytelling I do myself, I mean people don't know maybe I do a lot of writing. It's mostly in the fantasy genre and it's mostly like weird, very niche kind of stuff. Yeah, but the thing that I'm really going for, and if I and most of it, by the way, I don't publish. I have published some of it. I'm going to publish some more maybe next year. But a lot of times, like these are just like stories that I write to read around the campfire, and
Mm,
that's the core audience is just like
yeah.
four people. But if one of those people comes away with the sense of I always knew the world was like this, that's the thing that I'm looking for, and that's the sort of the measure of success for me. And but that was exactly my sense of going to divine liturgy for the first time.
Yes.
With the
Yeah,
sense
me
of
too.
I always knew it had to be like this. Like
Yes.
my entire life, I felt like everybody was telling me there's no room for these kinds of things and everything. But then when you read the Bible, and I'm big on reading the Bible, when you read the Bible, like this is how it is. There's like there's censors and there's images and there's art and there's beauty and there's all these different things and like all the stuff in the Psalms. Like it's very hard to like read the ways that the psalmist says you should be praising God and then look at what we're doing down at First Baptist and be like, what's the disconnect? What's going on? Like why aren't
Yeah.
we? But then going into my first divine liturgy and just saying, I always knew it had to be like this. It's
Yes.
like finding out Narnia is real. That's what it's like.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I totally get that. That resonates so deeply with me. Um, do you know Nathan Jacobs? I'm
That
assuming you
name is
do.
really familiar to me.
So he made a documentary called Becoming Truly Human, and it was
Okay, yeah, 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 yeah.
about
I
like
mean, I don't know him, but I've seen his documentary. Yeah.
yes. And so he had a conversation with Paul a long time ago, and he was talking about the process of making the documentary and everything. And I was in the middle of making my documentary, and I was sort of wrestling with, do I put myself in the film or not? And I couldn't make a decision. And I saw this documentary where he basically went through this journey of talking to people who are non-religious affiliated
No.
and decided to put his own story into it
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
to kind of, how would you say it? Like add this level of which like this deepness of like, okay, these people don't have the answer, but I went through this journey and now I feel like I do, and that might give people hope.
Yeah.
And so I asked Paul if I could like reach out to him, and he ended up just sending me to his website. But I reached out to him and asked if he could talk to me about the film, and he was like very gracious to sit and talk to me about like the film and my
Yeah.
stuff. And anyways, that stuff is not The point is, when we were having that conversation, he was the one who planted these like seeds for me of like orthodoxy by talking about how when he was teaching church history to college students, all of a sudden they were becoming Orthodox without him even trying. And it was like, oh, that's interesting. And so then when I eventually finally went into a church, it was like this experience where I didn't go in thinking I was going to like it, but I walked in the door and I sat down for the whole service, and like everything that I had learned from Tim Mackey all of a sudden clicked, and it was like, oh, like you see the smoke and you're just like, all is hevel, all is hevel. And you're just like, and you watch them do these movements and you're like, I don't know what that means, but it has a meaning and I want to know. And like, long story short, I left that service going, I don't know what this is, but I want to learn more. And I don't feel like I can call myself a Protestant anymore.
Yeah.
And that was just like this upheaval. And then after I had that experience a little while back, I went back to Nathan Jacobs and I was like, okay, I think I want to possibly become Orthodox.
Yeah.
What should I do? And he goes, well, I don't know, like go to church. And, no, this is what he said. He said, well, you can maybe read the Saints. And then he suggested, what's her name? Matthew Green's book.
Frederica.
Frederica Matthew Green's book, Facing East. But he's like, but you really should just go to church. And so I took his advice and I just went to church. But I also ordered Facing East. And I haven't actually read that book, but the first chapter was so interesting because Frederica Matthew Green talks about her experience of being in the Orthodox Church for the first time. And she talks from it at first from her husband's perspective of like, he's sitting there and he's having this experience of like, this is the most true thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And all she is doing is sitting there thinking, my feet hurt.
Yeah.
And it was so funny to me to see this sort of like role reversal where it was like, for me, I was the man in that situation, where it was like there was something so deeply true about it for me that it like I couldn't unsee it. But for her and for a lot of women, it's like the struggle of like, oh well, my feet hurt.
I think that there's actually really something to be said like in defense of the feet hurting people.
Yes.
Like that's not a wrong reaction to liturgy. Like your feet actually hurt, like that's a good embodied, kind of way. But I think that for people who are like artistically or spiritually intuitive, there's a lot about the liturgy that just sort of like, again, I don't know exactly what that means, but I know it means something. And I mean, when I was first kind of starting out, of course, obviously I read all the stuff before I visited an Orthodox church. So it was pretty sure it was like, I definitely think I know everything. And then I showed up and I was like, I have no idea what is happening right now. Like this is totally, but the advice that I was given, and I think it's pretty good advice, was like, for like a year, don't do anything but read the Gospels and go to liturgy. That's it. Like, don't try to read anything else. Don't try to like figure out what's my exact stance or opinion on this particular thing. Just like read the Gospels and go to liturgy and let that do its work. And, and that was just such a powerful thing. But I think that so since you're Orthodox, since you've been to liturgy, I can say that there is something about the liturgy itself, and this is something that you find in a very strong commentary tradition that actually exists in the West as well, although I don't think people really talk about it anymore. But I have some great books about this from Western authors from the Middle Ages. The idea that's really appealing to me is the idea of the liturgy itself as a drama, like a divine drama. And like the best person for this is Saint Maximus the Confessor, and some other people did a pretty good job of like Saint Germanus of Constantinople, for instance, who look at the way that the drama of salvation, right, is kind of recapitulated in the liturgy. And but it happens on, so Saint Maximus identifies, for instance, like 5 or 6 different levels this is happening on, and I've only ever been able to explain 4 of them, because the other ones I'm like, I don't even know what he's talking about here. Like Saint Maximus obviously experienced the liturgy on a higher level than what I do, but just in a way that because salvation plays out in history, it also plays out in your life. And and so you could say like your own life is a, a recapitulation, like when you are baptized, right? You're participating in Christ's death and resurrection, right? When you
Mm-hmm.
partake of the Eucharist, you're participating in Christ's incarnation, right? He's becoming flesh and blood for our sake.
Right.
When you die, you experience the last judgment. Like, this is
Yeah.
why, typically speaking, as
Mm-hmm.
Orthodox Christians, you shouldn't be like overly concerned about when is the world going to end, because you don't know when the world's going to end. You have a pretty good idea of when your life is going to end. Mine is going to end sometime in the next, what,
100 years.
40, yeah, 40 to 50 years if I'm really lucky, like if I'm really healthy and whatever, that's probably about as much time as I have left. And so I don't know when the world's going to end, but I have a good idea when my life is going to end. And that is
Mm.
the last judgment for you when you die. That is the last judgment. So,
Yeah.
but so there's that level. And then there's the level of, sort of history writ large as, God's economy of salvation for all of the human race. And those things, interact with each other in time and space, and especially in the liturgy when everything kind of converges into that single point. And that's St. Maximus's big idea.
Yeah.
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 So I think that you can also, but Dante does this as well in the Divine Comedy. He takes his personal arc of salvation, right? Going from he's the one lost in the dark wood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that he's lost his capacity to actually see the world in an enchanted way. He's lost his capacity to see God in the world, right? His eyes aren't strong enough to look on God, right?
Yeah.
And that he goes on this journey basically so that his vision can be strengthened and that his soul can be
Mhm.
purified. But then that journey along the way, he meets people from all across time. And the people he's meeting from all across time show
Yeah.
the way that God's divine economy of salvation plays out. But then
Yeah.
there's also this third level, which is Dante's contemporary political situation, being in Italy, being in the Holy Roman Empire, and all of this other stuff. So that's all three of those layers are constantly, but they're doing that interlace thing where they all kind of move in and out of each other. And but that's what traditional storytelling can do. That's what the liturgy can do. And the way to try to figure out how to, if you wanted to tell a story like a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
the thing to do would be to figure out how do we interweave things? How do we tell a story
Mm.
so that the story of a soul is also the story of the human race? I think that's
Yeah.
the thing to figure out how to do. And
Yeah.
and you can do this obviously like in a high art or like an indie film kind of a way, but there's no reason you couldn't do this with a big budget blockbuster. There's
Sure.
absolutely no reason.
Yeah.
But you would have to, and in some senses be easier because the nice thing about fantasy stories and superheroes and stuff is all these things where their insides on their outsides, right? So you could have, if you just again pay attention in a self-aware way to the demands of the art, the demands of the demands of the form, right?
Mm.
So that, superhero stories, there are particular archetypes, and
Mm.
those archetypes demand to be treated in a certain way. And it's actually when we fail to do that that the form starts to fall apart. But
Mm.
there are archetypes for the human soul. I mean, the Dark Knight, right? The second one in
Yeah.
Nolan's is a great example of this.
Yeah.
That and there's actually a great flip at the end because you think the person that you think is supposed to be the human soul or like the soul of Gotham isn't actually. It's and
Mm.
flip at the end where you actually realize the soul that we've been fighting over this entire time has been Harvey Dent's soul.
Mm.
And anyway, there's a lot of great stuff we could talk about there. But I think that
Yeah.
I think that if you had if you could tell a story in this way, so that the story simply works on more than one level, as all good traditional stories do. Like fairy tales work on more than one level. You can just read a fairy tale and enjoy the fairy tale as is. You can read the fairy tale as like some kind of a commentary. Some people get irritated, Christians get irritated by this, but you can definitely, like, all fairy tales are to some extent about crossing thresholds from
Yes.
adolescence into adulthood,
Mm.
and the kind of the self-knowledge that comes with that. But then also all fairy tales are about the resurrection, right? They're about death and the fall and the resurrection. And
Yeah.
they work on, the reason they're so good is because they work on those multiple levels. And that's the thing I would just say if you're trying to be a storyteller. and you want to tell, that's what you want to go for. And the best way to get there, I think, is to just immerse yourself in traditional stories until they're coming out of your pores, and then just write whatever you want to write. And
Mm.
write it for somebody. Write it for somebody. And the person you write it for, they'll love the story, and maybe the rest of the world will love it too. But we have to think that probably the greatest stories ever told, 90% of them were never written down.
Yeah.
And just also have to kind of be okay with that, as like one possible outcome is that you make something. And this is hard to say because I've never had to make my living off of this. I can go crunch numbers and pay the bills, and storytelling is an avocation for me. But um, it's a different matter when you're trying to figure out, how do I make money off of this, especially
Yeah.
especially when it's something like filmmaking, which, like I said, I'm
Yeah.
uncomfortable talking about it because I know that there are complexities that I don't understand. But
Yeah. Well, Nate, when I was talking to Nathan about it, he called it like, filmmaking is Vegas. Sometimes you hit the jackpot, but like most of us
yeah,
are just struggling here, not making
yeah, yeah,
anything.
yeah, that's good.
And like, it's true. And it's like, do you like, I don't know, in my mind, I'm thinking like, do you believe in divine providence enough that the people who get the jackpot were worthy of it?
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, I did like a little series on Taylor Swift and sort of her cultural, um,
Oh boy, I
how
have to
would you
go
say?
check that out now because
Yeah, well, I don't know if
Paul
it's,
Paul Vanderklay asked me the other day about Taylor Swift.
oh, really? It's in the water. Everybody, I did this like
I
little
was like,
series
I
on
was not
Taylor.
prepared to. Yeah, I wasn't prepared to talk about that today, but yeah.
No, did this little series on Taylor Swift because I'd just been like, I don't know, well, enchanted by her, just like everybody else is. And it's like, what is going on with Taylor Swift? Why is she like, why did she do what she did? And well, anyways, I won't get into that. You can watch my series if you want to know my thoughts
Yeah, no,
about
I'd be
that.
very interested actually.
But she, in one of her songs, called "The One," she kind of basically has a story about like the lost love, the one that in her heart she wanted it to be the thing, and it didn't end up. But it was sort
Yeah.
of this sort of like contentment of like, okay, like the first line is like, I'm doing good, I'm on some new shit, I'm saying yes instead of no, kind of like really just like there's this contentment of like, oh, I'm having a good time. But there's this like really cutting line for a filmmaker where she's like, the greatest films of all time have never been made.
Mm.
And you can kind of see that as a sad thing, like, oh, they were lost to time. But then as a filmmaker, there's this hope where it's like, but we can make them.
Yeah, there's got to be some sense of I think you'll track with this analogy. So some people, when I've had family members that have been very critical of our conversion, and it's a difficult situation, and
Yeah.
part of the reason, is because they feel like, oh, you're rejecting our family, you're rejecting the things that you were given and everything.
Mm,
And I've always tried to be as grateful as possible, and say, listen, I'm not rejecting what I've been given, I'm just trying to complete it.
yeah.
But there is a part of me that says, listen, wouldn't it be great to find out that there was more?
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
wouldn't it be just amazing to find out that there's actually more to the faith, and more to God, and more to the world? Like, deep down in your heart, like, you have to know this isn't all there is.
yeah.
And I
No,
think that's the same thing with that line that you just said. Like to me, it's comforting to know, man, there's a really great story that hasn't been told yet. Like,
yeah.
there better be. There dang well better be, because
Yeah.
because because otherwise, like, what's the point in even trying?
Oh, 100%. Well, and it's interesting that you say that because I had a conversation with this guy. He goes, I'm blanking on his name right now, but online he goes by Secular Rarity. And I had a conversation with him, and he asked me that question of like, okay, well, if you could be proven that God didn't exist, would you would you believe it? And I'm like, well, sure. And he's like, well, what would change? And I said, well, the world would be a lot less interesting.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like, and at that point, there was still a lot of doubt in my mind because I hadn't, I think, I had either just become Orthodox or I was like right on the cusp of it, like
Mhm.
about to have chrismation, and that like realization of like, why is Christianity so appealing to me? Because so many people see it as, you know, um, evil. Like from the Sam Harrises who think like there is a
Yeah.
moral landscape, or even the Christopher Hitcheses who say, like, um, God is not great. But it's like, well, let's think of a world without him.
Yeah.
That seems like a far bleaker existence.
Yeah.
And if I'm wrong about it, well, it doesn't matter anyways. So why
Yeah.
not? Why not?
Pascal,
Why not
maybe.
hold
Yeah.
on hope for this like transformative power, which we get glimpses of every day? And
Yeah.
like the clearest form of it is in nature with the seasons. But that isn't the most powerful form because we see it every day with human beings, where little by little by little, we see people become more beautiful. Like, why wouldn't you want to believe that? I don't know. Like, I don't know. But I'm a hopeless romantic. So, and I've been told recently by someone that they don't think that Orthodoxy is romantic. And I strongly disagree with that. But
But it,
I can understand their point.
don't, well, yeah, I'm not sure what that means. I don't
Yeah.
know. Like,
But like the greatest story of all time should be romantic.
there's no love story. Is that what they mean? Or what do they mean? It's not romantic in the sense of like 18th, 19th century romanticism
I
or?
don't know. I think people, well, and I think I had this ability too. I have this friend Victoria. She's a hopeless romantic. And I always just say, I don't think I'm a romantic. And she would tell me, "No, you are. You're just like a true romantic. Where you don't like the fluff, you don't like the kind of surface level thing. You like the real thing."
Mhm.
And it's like the more that I've like let that little seed grow in me, the more I'm like, oh, she's so right. Because like, I just want to love people with everything that I have. And like most artists do. Like even look at Taylor Swift. She built a whole career on love.
Yeah.
And people make fun of her because it's like, oh, you're gonna change Shakespeare. And it's like, well, maybe Shakespeare didn't have the whole story, you
Yeah.
know? Maybe he didn't factor the end, which is life and life eternal, which
Yeah.
doesn't come from fear, but from love. And, if
Hmm.
you can, do you know Bob Goff?
Mm-mm.
So Bob Goff was like the mentor of Donald Miller. Do you know Donald Miller?
Not really, I don't think.
Okay, Don Miller wrote Blue Like Jazz and a couple
Oh,
other.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So Bob Goff was the sort of mentor of Donald Miller,
Okay.
and
These
he
names
wrote.
like all sound like vaguely familiar, by the way. It's just,
Well, and
just
it's all funny because it all connects to the Bible Project in this weird way, where the Bible Project campus is like sort of an annex from this church that like had these really like kind of wooey sort of like
yeah.
romantic people. But
Yeah.
anyways,
Yeah. Yeah.
Bob Goff wrote this book called Love Does, and he
Okay.
just wrote stories from his life where he like didn't quit on love and it turned out beautifully. Like he talks
Yeah.
about the story about how he met his wife and how his wife like adamantly did not want to go out with him. But
Mm.
every day he put like a peanut butter jelly sandwich on her, like gave her peanut. I'm not remember. I might not be remembering this quite well, but like he kept giving her like love notes or something,
Yeah.
um, and every day until she wore down, and now they're like hopelessly in love. And then he talks about how when he wanted to go and be a lawyer, he got rejected from all of his schools, but he knew the one that he wanted. And so every day he went to the dean's office, he sat on the bench, and he just waited. And the dean wouldn't give him the attention at all. But then after like a week, one day the dean comes in, walks straight to him, and goes, "Buy your books."
Nice.
And he became a lawyer. And it's sort of like,
I
wow, like it's like it opens the door of like perseverance of like the thing that I'm suffering for has a meaning. It's not
yeah.
meaningless. And it's more beautiful than I could ever have imagined in my entire life. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I think that you could say Orthodoxy is not romantic in the way that it's not it's not super touchy-feely,
It's
you know?
it's like a period piece.
Yeah.
It's like the romance of the Pride and Prejudice era, where you
But
have
it's also like the work of a real relationship, though.
yes,
That's the thing. Where I mean, you think
mm,
about what you just said. This is what made me think of this. You just said this about like here's the thing that I love, so I'm gonna suffer for it,
yes,
right? If you think about something like Lent, why do we put ourselves through this? So for people
right,
who
right,
don't know, Lent is very long for us. it's 40 days where 40 means 60 for some reason. And
Oh, I didn't
uh
know that.
well, it's really like it's like 40 days plus weekends where you're still sort of fasting and going to church, and then in
Oh,
addition to Holy Week and everything. So if you actually do the math, it's like 50 something days. It's a symbolic 40, you could say. So we go
symbolic
through
40.
this so we go through this period of like really one of the hardest things you can possibly, like, if you really like went to all the services, kept the fast, everything, it's one of the hardest things you ever put yourself through.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get to Holy Week and you're like completely exhausted, and you're like, all right, now it's time for like the big push. So
Mm-hmm.
there's over 40 hours of Holy Week services, and not everybody can go to them all, but there have been some years where I've been able to take off work and just go to church for the week. And so you're going to these Holy Week services and you're just dead on your feet, and like you feel totally
Mm-hmm.
empty, and like you hit a point where you can't even repent for your sins because like you just lost the capacity to think thoughts with your brain.
Yeah. Well, and the
Then
sins are too many to even
yeah,
like how do you account for a lifetime of sin? Like
right,
I don't
yeah,
even remember when I was 2.
right, yeah. But then Pascha night hits, and the joy washes over you. And then for 50 days, you just live in the light of the resurrection, really the wedding feast.
Yeah.
It just goes on and on and on and on. And to me, like that's more real. It's more romantic in the sense of, if you know what it's like to suffer and deprive yourself for somebody that you love, which all mothers have some idea what that's like.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know if you heard me tell the story of how I met my wife.
Mm-mm.
But I met her when I was 10 and she was 14,
Oh.
and she was just like this amazing thing that broke into my world. And I just said, I'm gonna marry her. And then I spent the next 10 years like trying to do that, and in retrospect, like it's weird, it's a weird story to tell because like how do you as a 10-year-old boy, like how do you work towards what does it look like to like pursue a girl when you're 10 and like get married when you're 20? And it looked like a lot of hard work. Like I finished college when I was 19. The only reason I did
Mm-hmm.
that is because there were all these other guys who were also interested in her, who were 4 years older than me and who I had to sort of catch up with.
Yeah.
Right. And so like I just literally for 10 years of my life just worked my ass off so that I could marry her. And we have 5 kids now, so things are going great.
Mm.
One on the way as well. So,
Yeah.
thank God, like things are wonderful.
Yeah. Thank
But
God.
but that sense of, and but then, since then there have always been things like always these demands to for me to give of myself for her, and of course for her to give of herself for me, like every single day. And the romance kind of continues, and it continues in this the thing that like after the credits roll, like the romance has to keep going or it's not a good marriage. And
Mm-hmm.
the tragedy of so many love stories, this is the end with a wedding, and actually the wedding is the beginning of a love story.
Mm-hmm.
And um and I know why they end with a wedding, and it's not necessarily wrong or bad or whatever, but you do continue. And but Orthodoxy is like this. Orthodoxy is like the constant work that you put into the marriage to make the marriage live and blossom and be whole.
Yeah.
And that like and you really do have this strong sense, I think, of being the bride,
Mm-hmm.
and if we think about like why do we fast, it's not because God is somehow pleased that we're hungry or our feet hurt or whatever, but when we do these things, they're offerings.
Yes.
When we do these things, there's a story that one of my mentors told me about this. The story comes from the Simonis Petrus Monastery, which is a monastery on Mount Athos that I have some connections with, and through my spiritual fathers. And there at the monastery, there was this this old monk, and the people sitting, sleeping in the cell next to him, every night they would hear this thump, 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 like over and over again all throughout the night. And they're getting really annoyed. So one of the young monks goes and opens the door after several nights of this, goes and opens the door, peeks it open a crack to see what the monk is doing. And what he sees is this old monk is doing prostrations all through the night,
Mm.
doing prostrations. And because he's old, he's sort of like falling onto the floor with each one. And so they're looking at this and they're saying, oh, well, this has got to be just vainglory or whatever, which is always a concern in any kind of a religious setting, right?
Right.
And so they go to the abbot of the monastery and they say, Father so and so, he's just like doing prostrations all night. It's keeping all of us up. We're pretty sure he's just full of himself. Can you please make this stop? And so the abbot calls him in and says, Father so and so, I hear you've been making prostrations all night. What's going on? And in his very simple way, this old man just says, but I don't want Christ to forget I'm here. Like asceticism is this constant knocking on the door, right? To say, Christ, I'm here and I love you. Christ, I'm here and I love you. And we do this by giving sustained, prolonged attention, by suffering for the one that we love and who loves us. And like this is, so to me, like, I mean, that's romance.
Yeah.
That's romance. But very, but I think we've been really done a disservice by the kind of romance stories that we have, that our culture has given us, where it becomes about, I just need the big moment and the big feeling. I mean, you mentioned Pride and Prejudice, right?
Yeah.
But Pride and Prejudice is written against the background of the growth of the Methodist movement in England. And if you're not familiar, basically, this is where the whole idea of a conversion experience really starts. So there's this thing in Protestantism that you'll be familiar with where like you have to have some kind of like a conversion story, right? Where you have an arc of like there's all this resistance, and then I finally said yes to Jesus and I let him in, and now my life is great. And it's but that arc influenced the way that Pride and Prejudice like is shaped, because Austen was influenced by this movement. And so you have the same thing like with Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, where there's like all this resistance, and then there comes a moment of like the sudden warming, the change of heart, the moment, and people are always dripping wet in these moments. I don't know what that's about, but seems like in every movie, right?
The tears,
And
the saints'
yeah,
tears, just washing
tears
them
of
clean.
rain, or you fell in the pond or whatever, but like you're soaked, and there's this moment of conversion, and you become converted to love this person, and then at that point, like your love is real. That's how you know.
Yeah.
And in a certain way, like this is wrong, because it's not like that's no way to run a marriage, right? But on the other side, like what the church does give you is the capacity to actually just do that every year, right? And so like if you just, instead of like chasing like whatever the next high is, like what's the next thing I'm going to convert to, instead of chasing that, just convert to Christ every year, living through the cycle of the church year. And that's where, going back to what we were saying, your life as an individual, the story of you being saved, overlaps with the story of the economy of salvation, which is what you're living through in the church year. And that's that multi-layered kind of embodied meaning that we're talking about in traditional storytelling. So anyway,
well, that was a lot. That was but so interesting. I feel like if I ask any more questions, it'll take us down another rabbit hole that will take another hour to answer. But do you have any questions for me before we land
I
the
don't think so.
plane?
I'm gonna have to go watch your Taylor Swift videos. I'm definitely not her target audience, and I never really sort of got what's going on there. But
Well, that
but
was
I'm definitely a skeptic, so I'll have to take a look at what you have to say.
well, that was sort of where I came from, where it's like I was her target audience,
Yeah,
but I was a skeptic. But
Yeah.
like it's interesting because she's like the queen of subversion. She's like
No, I definitely see that. That's why I'm suspicious. But anyway,
yes,
yeah,
which like is fair enough because it's like
yeah,
why turn the story over if it's so beautiful? But like
right.
there's also this recognition that as humans, we have this hope for life, but we experience death every day.
Yeah.
And like in her 1989 era, she has this one song called New Romantics, and it's like this really upbeat like song. But like you read the lyrics and they're like cutting. There's like I could build a castle of all the bricks you threw at me. Like every day is like a battle, but every night it feels like a dream. And like the whole thing is like we're the new romantics. Come along with me. Heartbreak is our national anthem. We sing it proudly. But like at the end, it's sort of like I think the hook is like, please take my hand and take me dancing, and then leave me safe and stranded. And if you really read that with earnestness,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
isn't that marriage? Like, take my hand, like, leave me safe and stranded. Like, don't, it's so
Yeah,
romantic. Like, it really is. Like, it's so romantic. And that's why Love Story, as much as we can like cringe at it and be like, it's tricky, it's like, everybody wants that subversion because we don't want them both to kill themselves. That's not a good
right.
ending.
Well, Romeo and Juliet is not a love story. This is
Yes.
different. It's
Yes.
a
Well, that's
Yeah,
that's
but
it.
anyway,
That's
it's a
it.
different thing. But yeah, Romeo and Juliet is not
It's a tragedy, not a comedy. Yeah.
it's a tragedy, but also it's probably something that Shakespeare wrote as almost like a self-conscious parody of the courtly love tradition,
Mm.
which is like another thing that's going on. Like if you sort of pay attention, you're like, man, Romeo's no kind of a boyfriend. Like this is no kind of a person, like this is no way to court a woman. But anyway, I think that Romeo and Juliet, now his love story that I think he gets very right is Much Ado About Nothing, which is
Mm.
which is a fun the name of the it's one of his comedies, right? But a comedy for Shakespeare means a story with a happy ending,
Yeah.
right? And it's the name itself, Much Ado About Nothing, is actually a dirty pun, by the way, which I think
Mm.
not a lot of people know. And Shakespeare was somebody who had a keen appreciation for a dirty pun, which I do as well. And so I like that a lot about him. But there's Shakespeare does get love right a lot of times, but Romeo and Juliet is not a love story, and we've really done ourselves a huge disservice by trying to reinterpret it as one, I think.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, yeah,
And yeah, that might be a good place to leave it. Leave it with the
yeah,
mystery of that question of
yeah,
how is it
yeah.
not a love story? But
Yeah, yeah. I
no,
mean, but I think he wouldn't have thought it was a love story. He would have been like, "What are you guys doing?"
yeah, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Richard. This was really nice. I really
Thanks
enjoyed
for
the
having me. What
conversation.
a great conversation. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. And God bless your endeavors, filmmaking and storytelling, and all the other things.
Yeah, you too. You too.